Hello, my name is Suzanne Morton, and I'm on the faculty at the University of Delaware. I was asked to give a presentation today about the most recent updates to NIH application forms. So in May 2020, the new forms version F were released, and along with that came some updates to the human subjects and clinical trials information section. And so that's the section specifically I was asked to talk to you about, and I'm going to go over in the next few slides. So I'm going to start with actually kind of the take-home message, and that is that with the two most recent revisions to the NIH application forms, major changes have been put in place to the way the human subjects section looks. The previous version, Forms E, which came out in 2018, and now is kind of been fine-tuned with Forms F version, really I think are largely in response to NIH coming out with its updated and revised definition of a clinical trial. So most of the changes that I'll alert you to have to do with um, that revised definition of a clinical trial and really making sure that all the necessary documentation related to conducting clinical trials is put in place and described clearly in the human subjects forms. Um, there are new questions, additional sections that now, particularly with the new version, Forms F, align pretty closely with the questions and sections that are in clinicaltrials.gov. And as I'm sure you know, clinicaltrials.gov is where you are if you are running a clinical trial where you are required to register and report that clinical trial. So, as I said, many of the sections in clinicaltrials.gov are now reflected in similar sections of the NIH Forms F. Also, with these revised forms, there is now a breakdown of your human subjects and clinical trials information by study. Whereas previously you could talk about, for example, the protection of human subjects sort of globally for all aspects of your proposal. Now you have to specify the details for each individual study in your proposal. And overall, there's just a requirement for much more detail than there ever was before. So um, this is a good time if you're gearing up for a proposal to be sure that you kind of schedule in extra time in your grant writing to deal with the new Forms F human subjects section. If you haven't written a grant before, or if you haven't written one since before 2018, you'll be surprised at how time consuming the process is now. Okay, so just let me take a sidebar for a moment to kind of refresh your memory on the NIH's revised definition of a clinical trial. And so this is, I put it in quotations here because this is pulled directly off the NIH website. A clinical trial is a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or more interventions, which may include placebo or other control, to evaluate the effects of those interventions on health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. So that may not sound all that different to what you think of a clinical trial, but sort of the devil is in the details here. And really, what was prior to 2018 often not considered to be clinical trials is now considered clinical trials. And so this is another, again, I put this in quotations because I lifted this right from the instructions packet for the new Forms F. This is sort of a word of warning directly to investigators who do basic and mechanistic studies involving human participants. Again, prior to 2018, much of this type of work would have not been considered a clinical trial, but now it is. And so they say in the instructions here specifically, the NIH definition of a clinical trial encompasses a broad range of studies, including studies using human participants that aim to understand fundamental aspects of phenomena, the pathophysiology of a disease, or the mechanism of action of an intervention. So they're really pointing out here, you're not, the purpose of the study may actually be to look at something quite mechanistic, but if it involves an intervention of any kind, it's a clinical trial. And then they also add here, this includes, for example, you might be responding to a funding opportunity announcement that's given the title of basic experimental studies, but you still may have clinical trials embedded within that. So the way in the new human subjects and clinical trials information form, the way that they ask about clinical trials is by sort of separating that definition into 4 questions. And so you have to respond to all 4 of these questions. And the bottom line here is that if you answer yes to all 4 of these criteria, then your study is a clinical trial. The first question is, does the study involve human participants? Next, are the participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? Next, is the study designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention on the participants? And finally, is the effect that will be evaluated a health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome? And I've just kind of underlined here some of the key words or phrases that are really sort of the crux of the issue. Depending upon how you define participants, intervention, or biomedical or behavioral outcome, kind of determines whether or not you think your study is a clinical trial in many cases. And so let me just quickly kind of point out some interesting pieces about that. So the NIH, so that first question, does the study involve human participants? The NIH includes in its definition of clinical trials here any study that involves, at least one individual. So whereas in the old days, we really thought of clinical trials as only being sort of controlled, randomized studies of prospectively assigned groups of individuals, they very clearly point out here now that non-randomized studies, non-controlled studies, studies that don't involve a patient population, studies that only involve one group of participants, and even studies that only involve a single subject could be considered a clinical trial if they meet the other criteria for that definition, which is a very different and much, much broader understanding of the term clinical trials than was the case prior to 2018. So that second question that helps determine what's a clinical trial and what's not. Are the participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? So now the definition of intervention is important here. So the NIH defines an intervention as a manipulation of the subject or subject's environment for the purpose of modifying one or more health-related biomedical or behavioral processes or endpoints. So they give some examples. So an intervention, we probably traditionally think of in terms of drugs, biologic devices, procedures maybe, but they point out that the term intervention should be used much more broadly than that and would include things like delivery systems, any strategies, including things targeting prevention or diagnostics, would all be considered interventions. The other thing that I didn't include on this slide, but is also true of the term intervention, is that it does not have to be therapeutic. You don't necessarily have to have an anticipated, benefit of the intervention. You're just looking for a change in a health-related endpoint. And then that last question asks, is the effect that will be evaluated a health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome? which now makes understanding the definition of health-related outcome important. So the NIH gives a definition for this as well, saying that a health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome is a pre-specified goal or condition that reflects the effect of one or more interventions on human subjects' biomedical or behavioral status or quality of life. And so I just highlighted a couple of things here from the examples they give. These could include either positive or negative changes to, so this goes to the point I was making before, where the intervention doesn't necessarily have to be therapeutic to be a clinical trial. Positive or negative changes to physiological or biological parameters, but also psychological parameters, overall disease processes, and any health-related behavior or quality of life type metric. The other thing that they point out in sort of the extended definition is that these outcomes need not be long-lasting to be a clinical trial. So that includes outcomes that are very transient in nature, and intended to be transient in nature, still could constitute a clinical trial. Okay, so let's move on. Now that we've kind of covered clinical trials, I want to now get into the actual topic for discussion, which is these updated forms version F for the human subjects section. So I'm going to start by giving some disclaimers. And the first is to always be sure that you read your specific funding opportunity announcement first. There may be details in there or specific requirements in there that would supersede what's in sort of the general instructions for completing the human subject section, or for any subject, or excuse me, for any section for that matter. And then, so of course you want to know what's in your FOA. And then there are also some categories of grant applications that commonly are sort of exceptions to the rule, and I've listed some of them here. So training grants, fellowship application, career development awards like the K series, these commonly have sort of special rules and may not follow the general guidelines. So if you are applying for a very particular funding opportunity, or you fall into one of these sort of special categories or special circumstances, be sure to really read the funding opportunity announcement really closely, and the details in the application forms information packet, where they will kind of highlight for you places where career development awards or training grants or whatever have to follow some different procedures. So what I'm going to talk about is just an overview of some of the general application that's usually true for most of the R series grants, like R01s, R03s, R21s. But of course, you have to do your homework and make sure these things apply for you. So the first thing to note is that what we used to call in previous years the human subjects section is now referred to as the Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information Form, which is a lot more wordy, but that is the sort of updated, correct terminology to be using when talking about this section of the application. So the first thing to note, and by the way, I've tried to highlight with the green text here things that are new for Forms F. The first thing to note is that all applications have to include the Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information Form. And again, this is lifted right from the instructions. This is true regardless of your answer to the question, are human subjects involved? Okay, so even if your answer to the question, are human subjects involved, is no, you still have to complete the Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information Form. At a bare minimum, you're going to fill the top part of that form out, where the section called the use of human specimens and or data. section. Okay. So diving into that form now, the very first question of the Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information form is, does any of the proposed research in the application involve human specimens and or data? And it's just a checkbox, yes or no. And I believe this is, if I recall correctly, this is usually if you already have your other project information form done, this is a part of the grant application that comes much earlier. And this is the part where you check, sort of yes or no to, does the study involve human subjects? Does this study involve vertebrate animals? That sort of thing. There's a few other categories you have to answer yes, no questions to. So if you've already filled that out and you've indicated no, then this should pre-populate the answer to this question also as no. Does any of the proposed research in the application involve human specimens and or data? You say no, and if that's right, if your answer is no, then you're done. So you have to complete this form, but basically you're only completing the first question, and then you're done. And you don't have to do any of the rest of what I'm going to talk about after this. If your answer to this question is yes, then you have a lot more, unfortunately, a lot more work to do. And now you have to complete kind of the whole human subjects and clinical trials information packet. So diving into that now. So I wanted to, before I talk about some of the specifics of the, okay, so at the bottom of that Human Subjects and Clinical Trials Information form, it asks about study records. So at that point, so this is after you've already checked, yes, I do have human subjects in my proposal. Then it's asking you basically to attach one study record for each study you have. And so the NIH doesn't determine how many studies you have. You have to tell them how many you have. And so you have to break up your application into one or more studies. The studies, so you should be breaking up your project into sort of the most appropriate and most logical study groupings. So typically you would do this by what type of subject population you are using and what the data procedures or protocols are. For example, if I have all within my application, I have one study that, one part of the application that involves a certain set of procedures with a certain set of patients that would fit nicely into one study. Whereas in another part of the application, I have an experiment in which I am looking at a different patient population and they undergo a different set of procedures that I could call a separate study. So depending upon how you write your aims, your studies could be the same as your aims, or they might be different. You may have several experiments sort of lumped under a similar aim that might be best described as separate studies. Or alternatively, you might have, for example, if your application is a large clinical trial, and you have several aims that are different questions related to that trial, but if the trial has the same population and the same general procedures, you may only have a single study, even though your proposal has, 3 or 4 aims. Each study record is unique. It has a unique title. So the instructions tell you not to just name your study record forms as, study 1, study 2, study 3. They ask you to give them a unique name and a title that is relevant to the study, or excuse me, to the subject population or the protocol. And so at the bottom of this form, they give you instructions on how to add a new study. And so if you have one study, you will just add one study record. If your application has For studies, you would include for study records and so on. Okay, so what goes in these study records now? So the study records are basically broken down into 5 sections. And these are the titles of the 5 sections here. And I'll just go through each of those with you quickly. But before we do that, they make a point in the instructions of saying several times to not duplicate information in your research strategy that's already in your study record. So again, unlike in previous NIH forms where there was kind of minimal human subjects information given, you had to include everything in your research strategy section. Now they're saying, because I think this is because of the fact that they're asking for so much more detail now in terms of the protocol and the design and the power analysis and things like that, that it would be too much to include in the research strategy. So they say several times in the instructions that in your research strategy, you can sort of just give a brief description and then refer reviewers to the study record form in the human subjects and clinical trials information form. Okay, so they really don't want to see duplicated information in the human subjects forms and the research strategy. They also say do not duplicate information across study records. So, for example, you may have 3 studies in your proposal, and some sections of each study are unique, but there may also be some sections that are the same. So, one component is to address how you're going to recruit women and minorities. So maybe your approach to that problem is the same in all 3 of your studies. So you don't have to write that out 3 times and upload that same long document 3 times. Instead, what they ask you to do is write out that document for the first study. And then instead of writing it out again or copying that whole thing again, you would just indicate, you would still have to upload a document, but that document will just say, see the same section for the previous study for details, so that you're not making reviewers sort of read the same content again and again. Okay, so now to get into the details of what's in the study records. So section 1 of the study record form is called basic information, and really kind of the highlight of this form is that you have to answer the question, is this an anticipated clinical trial? And again, they spell out those 4 questions that I mentioned earlier, and you have to click either yes or no to all 4 of those questions. And if you answer yes to all 4, then that study is a clinical trial. So that's not to say your entire proposal is a clinical trial. Remember, you have individual studies. So you can have one study that's a clinical trial, whereas all the rest of your studies are not, or vice versa, doesn't matter. So if you answer yes for this particular study, yes to all 4 of those questions, then that study is a clinical trial. And so then you have to do sections 1 through 4, and you may also have to do section 5. If you answer no to all 4 of those questions, then that particular study is not a clinical trial. And so for this study record, you're only going to be required to do sections 1 through 3. Okay, so if your study is not a clinical trial, you're doing sections 1 through 3. If it is a clinical trial, you're definitely doing sections 1 through 4, and you may also have to do section 5. We'll get to that in a minute. So in addition to that question, there are other parts of this form, including just basic sort of starting and ending information and things like that. So let's go on to section 2. In section 2, you're really describing the study population. So this is why it's handy if you can break up your studies into individual populations. Then you only have to describe, for example, eligibility criteria for one group of individuals in any given study record. Of course, sometimes that's not possible. If an individual study is intended to make a comparison between two populations, then your eligibility criteria would have to be spelled out for both populations. So again, there are certain components of this that are text boxes that you just fill in information, and other components are where you are writing up documents, saving them as a PDF, and uploading them as attachments. So some of these things that I've mentioned down here lower are just that. These are documents that you would write, for example, in Word, and then save as a PDF and upload as an attachment. And in the document, they make that very clear where that's required. Another form that is new for the forms version F is this one called Inclusion of Individuals Across the Lifespan. And this replaces what used to be called inclusion of children, where you would indicate whether or not you're including children in your proposal, and if you're not including children, why not? Now you're addressing those same questions relative to children, but you're also addressing similar questions related to older adults. So if you are, for example, only testing young individuals, you need to provide a rationale, a scientific rationale for why you're not including children and why you're not including older adults. There's a form called Inclusion of Women and Minorities, which has not changed from previous years. Although I will note that if you're doing an NIH phase 3 clinical trial, you are asked to provide a lot more detail here on things like, for example, how you are going to randomize so that you don't have disparate groupings based on sex or ethnicity or race. You have to write, this is another attachment, the recruitment and retention plan, and then another attachment, the study timeline. And then finally, the inclusion enrollment reports. So this is, your planned enrollment tables. So in here you are indicating your plan for enrolling both males and females, and for people across racial and ethnic groupings. Okay. Section 3 is the protection and monitoring plan section. So here is where you would upload an attachment called Protection of Human Subjects. And again, if you've written NIH grants prior to 2018, you're familiar with this name. And this form has not changed substantially. So this is where you describe how you are going to protect the safety of your human subjects, what are the risks, what are the benefits, that sort of thing. You may need to upload a data and safety monitoring plan. So, and this depends on whether or not your study is a clinical trial. So if it's a clinical trial, you must include a data and safety monitoring plan. If your study is not a clinical trial, the data and safety monitoring plan is optional, but it still may be important, and you'll have to make the judgment of whether or not to include it on the basis of things like how invasive are the study procedures, what are the risks to participants, what are the concerns about recruitment, things like that. Any concerns along those lines might make you decide to include a data and safety monitoring plan. Within the data and safety monitoring plan, you may need to include a data and safety monitoring board. This is I believe, only required of phase 3 clinical trials, but there may be, again, just like the monitoring plan, there may be phase 1 or phase 2 clinical trials that should also have a data and safety monitoring board, depending upon, again, things like the burden to participants, possible risks, things like that. And there could even be non-clinical trials that you might want to have a data safety monitoring board, but that's less common. And then there's a final section place for an attachment that's called the overall structure of the study team. So this is always optional. And in the instructions, they explain that this is really intended to provide a space where there isn't any space elsewhere to speak to any concerns about the study team. For example, if you have a multi-site study where there needs to be quite a bit of communication across sites, or participants are going to move from site to site, something like that, where you really need to explain how those sites and investigators are going to communicate with each other. So multi-site studies, studies that have a large large number of team members, where you really need to spell out what each individual's role is and how they're all going to be accountable and work together. That's a place to provide that, but that is optional. Okay, then we move to section 4, which now we're reaching the sections that are only filled out if your study is a clinical trial. So section 4 is the protocol synopsis. So this is really now getting into the weeds of your clinical trial design. So this is why it's only necessary for studies that are determined to be a clinical trial. So here you're spelling out the details of your study design, your outcome measures, and they want this in like specifics. Your statistical design, your power analysis, and finally a dissemination plan where you're explaining how, since this is would be an NIH funded clinical trial now, you are held accountable to disseminating your results publicly. For example, if your trial is already registered on clinicaltrials.gov, you would give the clinicaltrials.gov ID number here, although it doesn't have to be registered prior to your grant submission. And then section 5. So this section is called other clinical trial related attachments. So this is, for most applications, you would not be completing section 5, but this is basically a space. Again, this would only be done for studies that are called clinical trials. So for your non-clinical trial studies, you wouldn't be doing this anyway. But this is to address any specific details that are required for a specific funding opportunity. Certain funding opportunities ask for additional details or comments, or to address certain issues. And so if there's no other place to do that, you would be including that in this section. But you would find out that you need to do that by reading your funding opportunity announcement. That's the only place where you would get instructions for the need to complete section 5. And then that's the last section. Just my final thoughts. I think I mentioned this before. None of this is really complicated, but it is time consuming and kind of a little bit, you need to have some close attention to detail so that you don't accidentally put certain attachments into the wrong study record form, which would then be confusing to reviewers. So make sure that you leave plenty of time to get this done, and to then, yourself or have someone else double check your work. Just another reminder, I said this before as well, but all NIH submissions, including those that don't utilize human subjects, still have to include this form, and you'd be just checking the box at the top that says, nope, I'm not using human subjects. So quick and easy process. And then because one of my other roles is as the director of the pilot projects core at the Delaware CTR Excel program. I just wanted to, I think there are a number of you in the Junior Investigators Network who may have put in letters of intent to complete a pilot grant proposal. If you are doing that, remember that your grant is being reviewed by Excel, but if you are selected to be recommended for funding, your application is also going on to NIH, and so you have to put in these the human subjects and clinical trials information form for your study. Okay, just as you would for NIH, and you need to do it with your Excel pilot proposal application. Included just a few what I hope are helpful links to NIH pages, including just the sort of general instructions packet, but also some other locations where they give you kind of a summary of how Forms F is different. That's this last one here. And the middle bullet is more detail on how NIH has determined the definition of a clinical trial. And that's it. I appreciate your time and attention.